Hello, and welcome back to Fantasy Grounds RPG Map and Image Creation. I'm Josh, and this is episode 7. Today, we're going to be, as you can see, we're going to be creating some forests for our landmass here, and continue on the tutorial series on how to create these regional style maps for your fantasy games, or any game really, or for any purpose for that matter. What we're going to be doing today is using a lot of the same techniques that we have done so far. And this forest area right here, I have created using nothing but some of the built-in features in Photoshop, as well as the random brush that we created when we created our landmass. And so why don't we get going? We'll be doing this from scratch here. So I'm just going to be turning these 3 layers off that I used to create the forest. And what I'm actually going to do is, if I switch over to my brush here, I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to make sure that it's inside all of the parameters. These layers that we're using actually are using a clipping mask for that original landmass, and we want to make sure that we're maintaining that so that everything that we do stays within the landmass. We don't want any of our forests coming out into the water. And so I'm going to make a new layer here. I'm going to make sure that this says that it is using our landmass as its clipping mask, and we're just going to do it like a normal layer. So we're going to hit OK. I'm going to pick a pretty dark kind of green color here, and this is going to be the color that we're going to start off with. Now, if you remember correctly, we had created this this brush shape from our landmass itself, and we helped use it to create some of our coastline here. And so we're going to use this over and over again, and I'm just going to come in here and make sure that some of my parameters are set in a particular way. I'm going to reattach this in here. And so I'm going to look at my brush parameters here a little bit. I want some randomness, so I'm going to increase my spacing. I'm going to go to my shape dynamics. We want some variation in our size and in our angle. And I am just going to start moving around here and doing some nice random locations. You can be as detailed with this as you want to be, and really get in there and change some of this stuff up. Maybe we have some nice big northern kind of forests here. And now I'm going to switch to my eraser. I'm going to use exactly the same kind of brush, and I'm going to set up some of the same parameters here. And so I want the same thing. I want some size, jitter, and some angle. And we're going to increase the spacing. I'm going to manually change the size here a little bit when I want to have a little bit more control. I want to create some of these little areas like this. So I'm going to go back and forth a little bit, where we get a lot of these broken up areas. And you can drag around as well. I think I'm going to keep this centralized area pretty free of the forested areas, but we'll do some deserty kind of stuff throughout this as well. And I'm just hitting B and E, going back and forth between my eraser and my brush. So I'm kind of putting things in and taking it out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take this layer that I've created. I'm going to hit Control T and I'm going to shrink it down. We don't have to worry about where we place it right now. I'm going to use this now as I switch back to my Move tool. Hold down Alt and I can drag some of these out. And because I want these shapes to be a little bit more broken up. And so I'm going to create a little bit of a interesting kind of dynamic here. And as I collapse these down into one layer, I often work this way. I take one base element and I break it up and I do more and more with it. Now I'm going to come in and I'm going to use my eraser to help control a little bit. We're gonna add some of these type stuff later on that's going to be on top. So we don't really want to interfere with our mountains too much right now. We're getting a much more natural kind of it seems to be a lot more kind of natural looking. I'm going to do this one more time. Let's swing it right around. Collapse that down, and I'm just going to erase through here a little bit. I'm going to widen the areas around our mountains. Like I said, we'll go back later and we're gonna add some of this forest, but we're gonna make sure that it interacts much better. And don't forget, you can go back to your brush and you can pull in some areas too if you want. If you think that there's going to be a lot of forested area around some of these rivers or whatnot. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. You know, this is a little bit much in here, but we can always go back later if we so decide, and we can adjust these after the fact as well. So now that we have all of our forest kind of laid out here, where it's going to be, we're just going to do a couple of simple tricks here. First thing we're going to do is go into our filter gallery. And you can see what I'm actually doing here is I'm using two filters on this. And the order is pretty important here, and I'll show you. But we're using our sponge, and we're using this, as we turn this off, you can see, I have a kind of simple texture that's going through here, and then the sponge is kind of breaking that up some. The only reason we do this is we want to get some color variation in here, and this is a very simple kind of easy way to do it. We want some dark areas and some light areas, so that way when we add our actual texture to it, some of this color information really comes out, and we can adjust some of the levels later on if we so desire. So what I'm using is a rough pastel. I have some pretty modest parameters here. I don't want it to be too intrusive or to cause too much interference with the actual color itself. But I do really want some of this canvas in here. And so I'm going to keep that at 100%, and I'm going to keep this at about 20 in the relief. And you can see that if we drop this down, it's less and less and less. And if we increase it, it's very, very abrupt. And so we're going to keep that at about 20. And so when we add our sponge on top of that, which again is very modest, it's just enough to kind of smooth out some of these transitions. And if we want to, we can increase the parameters and kind of smooth it out a little bit more. but I want some of these little bit of a dark area in here. And our definition, you can see, can drastically affect it. So we're going to keep that at about 1. And our brush size, again, can do quite a lot in there. So I'm going to keep that at 0. I want a kind of mix of some of this stuff. And we're just going to hit OK. Now you can see that a lot of this information, right, as it's through here, is quite a lot broken up. But these little variants are going to really add a lot to our image. The next thing that we're going to do is I'm actually going to just grab out another little one. I'm going to pop it out here, and I'm going to drop it down underneath. And it's a little bit askew, but that's okay, because what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to blur it. And that's going to give us that kind of halo that that if you see a landmass from a distance, you get a little bit of transition where the foliage goes from the tree line into maybe grassy areas, and it kind of dissipates out into the more rocky areas. And so I have it set, let's do about 30 radius in our pixels here. And that's going to give us a pretty good blur here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change this over to a multiply layer. And I'm going to hit Control U. And we want to lighten this up. We don't want it to be so drastic. And we're going to increase the saturation here. So we get this kind of nice fade. Depending on how much you want to do this with, we can always pull out another layer of this, and we could just do this a normal layer. Bring down our opacity quite a lot, just so that we get a little bit of a nice kind of transition there. Maybe down to 20. And we can kind of change the location of some of this stuff. We want it to be in our areas here, but we don't necessarily need it to match up perfectly. This is just helping us get some color variations throughout our map, and to do some little bit more interesting stuff here. So if we turn off our actual forested area, you can see that we're getting some nice color variations here very easily. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up double click on the layer and open up the layer styles here. And we're going to add some actual new information in here through the beveled and emboss feature. Now I'm going to set my screen to another kind of muted green here on the yellow side, because I want to make sure that that maintains a nice overall feeling of the vegetation. Set our screen down to around 20%. We don't want it to be too much. You can see that it gets a little bit out of control here. So we want a lot of subtlety here. Whoop, didn't mean to shut that quite yet. But let's go back here and look at this. We have black for our multiply in our shadowed area. Our technique is smooth here, and we want an inner bevel. I've set it to 100% and 5 pixels. For our size, that means that it's coming in from the edges 5 pixels, and we're going to soften it about 2 pixels. And so the main thing that we're doing here is we're adding texture to it, so we want to make sure that we have that clicked. Our scales are set to plus 100% and 100%. And inside of, you can use any sort of pattern that you've created beforehand. There's a lot of built-in ones inside of Photoshop for like trees. So we could use, this is the one that I was actually using, or grass. And so you can change, as you can see, how this interacts quite a lot. And finding something that you like and kind of gives the feeling that you want it to, you can go through and it's going to adjust all of these things. I like this one because there's a lot of areas that doesn't have a whole lot of texture, and it's broken up with ones that do. You can change the scale of this. If you think it's too much or too little, you can bring this down and make all sorts of adjustments. But let's keep it at 100%, at least for now. We can go back and change this later. And I'm just going to darken this up a little bit. I'm actually going to drop down the saturation. I don't want it to be super saturated, and maybe I'll keep this at 0 and just bring down some of that saturation. Things tend to become less saturated the further they are away. And there we have it. There is a very simple and easy way that you can create some rather fun and interesting looking forests for your regional map. It's very easy, it's very fast, and it's quite effective. Even if we come in here, you can see that this actually does look a lot like forested areas from a high up vantage point. So thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time in episode 8.